Hello, I'm George Seifers with Signal Magazine, and I welcome you to the Signal Media webinar series. We apologize for that slight delay, and we thank you for your patience. Today's webinar is with PACEA, and it is about protecting mission-critical audio and video data. We will be speaking with Scott Barella, PACEA's Chief Technology Officer, who has a long history in broadcast systems design and architecture, original equipment manufacturing and design, and systems integration and operations, including Internet Protocol video. When Scott is finished presenting, we will hold a Q&A for as long as time allows or until we run out of questions. So throughout the webinar, attendees are welcome to submit questions electronically through the Ask a Question box on the webinar console. And during the presentation, we will also include a couple of poll questions, so please be on the lookout for those, and we will discuss the results right before the Q&A begins. So with that, I think we're ready to get started. Scott, over to you.
Thank you very kindly, George. Today's webinar is about the idea of traversing audio and video and USB signals. So the first question I have is a question rhetorically. Is your data secure within a SCIF? Now, a SCIF is a sensitive, compartmented information facility. Most of these facilities are well known to some of you, maybe others, maybe not so much. But I wanted to make sure you were aware that there are facilities that are kind of cordoned off, and we question how secure these might be. So the idea here is that I'd like to discuss the kind of the designer's approach or the challenges that lie before us with respect to making sure that audio, video, and USB signals are secure. This is all about the video distribution system. And to begin with, we have to begin at the beginning, right? So most of these audio and video inputs are source devices that generate signals in a baseband environment, such as a microphone or a camera or any other kind of device that you would see or hear. The idea here is that you have a limited number of inputs and, of course, a limited number of outputs that feed the destination, such as displays and maybe USB keyboards and mice and CAC readers, for example, and other things that might be a headset or an audio feed or some measure. But the idea here is that this box in the center was built out of silicon because we were mainly dealing with baseband signals. So the thinking here is it has a very limited frame capacity. When you exceed it, it has to be replaced. So for example, if I have 1,000 inputs and 1,000 outputs, the second I add the 1,001st signal, the frame is no longer valid enough to help facilitate that extra signal. The frame has to be reconstructed and so forth. So that's a big limitation in baseband. In the general context of baseband signals, they were really never intended to be secure. These are common signals. Broadcasters used them with coax cable. Consumers did as well. We had an RCA connector for those. Later, as time went its merry way, we had VGA signals, for example, or DVI signals, and more modernly, the HDMI signal. Again, these were consumer-type signals or easy enough signals to be able to pull at any moment's notice and light up something. So there is no thought to security here. This is just a simple transport to make sure that whatever signal you have, you can easily traverse. We did try, I say we, as an industry, there were attempts at baseband scrambling. It didn't prove very fruitful. Networks eventually abandoned them because they're not foolproof, and eventually they just gave up on the whole idea. It's very, very difficult to do, and it creates a lot of other unintended consequences. Now, the baseband systems in general are very vulnerable, and they're very at risk. And the reason why is because they're completely transparent. It's the way they started, and as time continued on, these remained open. There was no idea or no separation of independent levels of security. They were all combined in a single common matrix. And even though the cables might be separated out for that, it still means that each one of those signals is vulnerable because they can be they can be distributed either inadvertently or hacked. There's also, as I stated before, limitations of scale. When you exceed the baseband frame, you can't go any further. You have to throw it out and start again. So the other part of this is that the signals proper, the actual signals that are emitted from the HDMI or the coax cables or Ethernet, those are signals you can't necessarily see or hear by any means, but they're easily to be plugged in because again, the signal is not protected. So theoretically, the HDMI signal could be plugged into any monitor that has an HDMI port, and you could see that. Same thing with a coax cable for analog video or even digital video. Same thing with Ethernet for control. As soon as you plug it in, it starts to work. That was the spirit of it when it began. The problem with it is that when you traverse these baseband signals, they're vulnerable. You really don't know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. The problem is it could be recorded, it could be taken, and it could be transported. So the idea of being able to take signals that belonged in one environment into another is a problem, especially in baseband. Now, if we consider the challenge of moving these signals from a baseband context to an IP context, in other words, Ethernet, we have some challenges even before we begin to protect these signals, right? So the bandwidth of real-time video is much different than it is for streaming video. So for example, if you're trying to get Netflix, it's quite easy to deliver over the internet. Why? Because they compressed the payload to extremely small quantities, but the quality isn't that great. But for real-time video, this is a challenge because these signals are quite large. The orchestration of these signals is also never been done before. It has been on a limited basis, but the orchestration of it for security levels hasn't really necessarily happened. Now, on the other hand, scalability is really good. We can start with a small set of inputs and outputs, and as we grow in time, they can increase them to almost any proportion we want to. Tens of thousands of signals could be scaled in this manner. The flexibility is also very good. Before in baseband, we had to be confined into terms of resolution and aspect ratio for video, and definitely audio formats are also a little bit restrictive. But in IP, they're quite flexible. The bottom line in all of this is even though we move from baseband to IP, we really haven't identified the primary problem, and that is we still have no security on it. It's just as open as if it were in the old baseband world. So if we do traverse it to IP, we have to address that. Pros and cons of using IP fabric for audio and video, right? So some of the positives are it's flexible and scalable, as I had mentioned, and it seems really the ideal choice to move signals from point A to point B. However, they're a little too easy to transport. How do we maintain security with that? The other thing is they're easily found. Ethernet is extremely vulnerable if it's left unencrypted. We've all read and heard of pieces and parts through the media that a certain a breach was found, somebody's data was exposed. These are all common problems in the IP fabric, so we need to address that in a very predictable fashion. I just saw last night a story on CBS News where they had found a hacker getting into video networks because the video was unencrypted, and guess what? All that video spilled out, and it's being presented to bad guys, right? Now, there's another problem, and this happened in the baseband world as well. When we expose video, we have to present a frame buffer so we can comprise the whole image as a raster. Line by line, we compose all of the pieces and parts of a video stream. We gather them up in a frame buffer, and then we present the data to the screen. When we make a switch to another source, we have the old frame buffer still filled with the old video, and we move from left to right. The frame buffer is exposing video from the other source that may not be authorized into the screen for just a brief second, and then finally the right video comes up. But we need to address that as well. So this is true not only of a baseband, but it's also true of Ethernet. Now, the other thing about Ethernet is it's easy to alter. We've all seen videos on the internet that had either national leaders or foreign leaders say something they didn't really say. These videos were altered. Well, the same thing can be true of live video. They could be altered in the same fashion. There's 3 planes on the left, and it could be altered to show only 2 planes. That might be disastrous in a skiff. But we need to be able to make sure that the signal from point A to point B is not altered and, in fact, received properly at the other end so that actionable items can be displayed properly. Now, the endpoints are very risky. This has been true from almost the beginning of using Ethernet, either for computer use or otherwise. And we want to make sure that any of the data that we have in Ethernet isn't walked away with, switched out, or tampered with. That's a problem. So we need to address that as well. Also, having access to content, it equals risks, right? We want to make sure that those who have access have the proper access. We're not letting all the keys to the store go out, and that's held true in data centers especially. A lot of the moves to data centers prevent this sort of thing, but all the content and all the control has to be secured and out of reach for only those that need to have access to that. Now, a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF, presents some other challenges. One of the things they did solve is the ability to cordon off certain environments so that only the authorized personnel that are working in a SCIF remain in the SCIF and all the information thereof, right? The cables, the power, the display monitors, everything stays within. However, it doesn't necessarily address accidental, malicious, or human error insider threats. And these are of great concern to anyone operating these kinds of environments. Now, question du jour.
Yes, this is our first of 2 poll questions. And the question is, what is your biggest security concern? Your options are insider threat, cyber attack external, illness compromising a C2, natural disaster, lack of backup plan, human error, or none of the above. And again, we will be discussing the results of the poll right before the Q&A. So we appreciate everybody participating. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Okay, so government working to secure all vulnerabilities. These are common topics that you'll see not only in these kinds of webinars, but other webinars around us. One of the topics that I attended not too very long ago is a session on zero trust. This is kind of the opposite of saying, okay, you've got credentials for a password, a username, and now you're in, you get to do whatever you're supposed to do. In zero trust, we keep asking questions, and we keep making sure that we don't really quite trust that even though the user might be in and authenticated, we're going to keep check and recheck and double check and triple check and quadruple check. The idea is that it never trusts ever, and there are other safeguards so that if there's something out of line, we can alert somebody that it's not quite right. We also have the challenge of creating different and cross domains. We might have a domain of secret. We might have another domain of classified. We might have another domain of unclassified or other domains. But we want to make sure we can separate those. Now, traditionally, they've been done with air gaps. This is a very effective means of doing that. But we're also gravitating toward artificial intelligence, or AI, to validate access. Mainly, IP secures a strategy, but they're also improving those pieces as we move along here. So we've acknowledged the fact that ID connects the world, and the problem with it is it's very, very common, so we need to be especially careful with it. And because it is common, that means the transport may be under attack. So the government, as well they should, created a standard to make sure that all IP utilizes FIPS cryptography. So if we're going to do anything with IP, we should encrypt it. I think that goes without saying, but that means even the baseband signals of the audio and the video and the USB. Now, here's our second poll question.
Thank you, Scott. The question is, what certification do all VDS-IP systems require to be secure? Your options are NIAP, FIPS, DODIN, JITC, or CSFC. And again, thank you all for participating. Scott?
Thanks, George. We'll move on here. Let me kind of break these out a bit so you have a better understanding on them. Many of you probably already know these, but just for review, the Federal Information Processing Standards has a piece for cryptography known as 140-2. The Department of Defense's Information Network has a thing called the Approved Products List. That's another certification. Obviously, there's common criteria. Those are used by some intelligence agencies, and others use CSFC. So if we break these down, FIPS is the first one, right? This is the Federal Information Processing Standard and was developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, NIST. It was done a fair length ago in 1994. The first standard of this authoring was done as 140-1. It's since gone obsolete and was replaced later by FIPS 142, which is still valid as we speak. We are moving on to 140-3, and there are some who are working and applying and testing against the new standard of 140-3. And in fact, 140-2 will end September of this year, and all certifications going forward will be using 140-3. Very few differences between the two, but they are updating as they all should, because all of the crypto changes from time to time. There are 4 distinguished levels. The bottom 3 address hardware, but the first one is the one that's is required for it all, and that's the software side of things. This is the first cryptographic element that has to be certified under the FIPS 140-3 or 2 standard. The second one is the Department of Defense's Approved Products List. This is administered by DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, and it's a part and placed on the Department of Defense's Information Network and the subsequent approved products list. The idea is that if a vendor wants to have his product approved or sold into Department of Defense installations, they need to go through a proper testing procedure at the lab designated by DISA, which is the Joint Interoperability Test Command, and they issue either an IO or an IA cert, and these are tested against security targets that they deem appropriate. This is true of the video distribution system. The second one, or the third rather, is common criteria. This is in an international standard. There are several countries, mainly NATO countries, that are participating in common criteria. For the United States, we use NIAP. That's the National Information Assurance Partnership. Under NIAP, there are 2 basic pieces of it. There is the EAL, which is the first and starter of the common criteria cert. And then the latter one is the protection profiles. The idea here is that in the protection profile, there's a specific device against a certain and specified set of a security target and a set of checks to go against that target, and they're either validated or not validated. In the EAL, it's a little bit looser. This is where it began, but there are 7 levels to the EAL cert. They start at the top and go to the bottom. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one's higher than the other. For example, number 6 isn't higher than number 4, but it is listed in kind of the way they added those pieces and parts to it. So in level 6, for example, it's semi-formal, and in number 4, it's methodical. So just because there's a level whatever number doesn't mean the higher number succeeds the others. You have to read closely. And that gets to my last point here. The EALs can be a doorknob cert if the security target isn't really properly listed. It's important to read through vendor certifications to make sure that whatever has been checked and double-checked, what it is. So the vendor may select to have a description of how its product works, much like a doorknob. If I turn the doorknob left or right, the lock becomes available, and then the door can be opened, and then the door can be closed. Even though it doesn't really address any kind of security target, it's perfectly legal in the EAL side. So it's very important to read up and make sure that the security target matches the set of requirements used and in the environment it's intended to be used in. So certs are only a part of the answer, right? Because we can build a nice castle, but it doesn't necessarily mean everything's been addressed, right? So this is kind of you have to take it with a grain of salt, so to speak. I have a lot of security requirements, for example, in certain environments and others differently. So we have to address a secure ability to scale depending on the use cases. So let's start at the beginning. The most common cert that is applied is the FIPS 140-2. This is extremely important because this is the crypto element, right? Now, we do know that DODN requires it and mandates that all IP, be it audio, be it video, be it USB, if it's on IP, then IP therefore has to be in crypto. And these are certified modules that I'm allowed to use. I could use advanced encryptions by either 256 or 128. Actually, 128 is no longer used, but this is an idea. This is where it's at. But the FIPS equals the crypto. It is not the certifications. The certificates. These are the certificates that are passed along. For example, you might have a certificate for a particular website on a secure website, the HTTPS part. That's a one-way cert. A mutual cert might be that the client has to ask the server and the server has to ask the client. That's called a mutual cert. This is not a part of the FIPS crypto. It's surrounding it, but it's not the actual crypto. There's also a public key, a private key. Those aren't a part of the crypto, but they are how we manage it. So the key to the key here is that the key is how we unlock the crypto. And so they're extremely important to have a management system be able to address not only the keys, but the tokens and the certs. These are all the IP communications that surround FIPS. Now, the SweepB Crypto does address these pieces, right? It addresses the AES side in two kind of flavors, one for low bandwidth traffic and one for high, known as CTR and GCM. There's elliptical curve transfer of keys for digital signatures and key agreements. This is the ECDH. There's also SHA, the secure hash algorithms, and they change from time to time. And as time proceeds, this is updated. And so the requirements change yearly. And so it's important for vendors to make sure that their keys and their certs are all meeting the requirements around the crypto that's being used. That addresses part of the issue. The other part is making sure that authorized personnel can see and hear and use USB, video, and audio devices as their classification dictates. So not only do we have the ability to close, or if we're going to design this, we should have a door to make sure that only personnel we're allowing in can be admitted in. But we have different doors, right? The idea is that we have several levels of authority. We have an unclassified level. We have a classified level. We might have more, for example, secret and top secret. So we have to have doors for each. So I've shown 3 doors here, and the physical security such as air gaps still apply. So we might be able to gain access to one of these doors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can traverse across the level. So the mandate would be to be able to make sure the signals, the audio, video, and USB signals, are in their proper authority level. So that if a classified a person needs to have access to certain signals, their authority level matches the device authority level. Those two are separate. And that kind of gets us to this point here where not only do we have levels for users, we have certain levels of authority there for maybe, say, for example, black might be unclassified, red might be classified, and yellow might be secret. And I'm just picking on those 3 levels. There could be more, right? There could be 8, 9 levels. But the system should accommodate different levels of authorization. That holds true not only for users, but for devices and nodes. So, for example, I just used the icon of a satellite. These might be encrypted video, for example, coming from a certain source or whatever. Now, those are decrypted for the SCIF, but we would still have to have a secret flow of video, maybe a classified source of video. And the same thing holds true of PCs and other pieces. We might have a SIPR computer, or we might have a NIPR computer. Those would be on different levels in accordance to there. So we might also have groups. We might have the whole room associated with a class group or whatever. And we might have areas physically that are conducting missions and so forth in different areas. So we have to keep track of all of these domains, and we have to make sure that we're abiding by the rules and regs of whatever that SCIF demands. Now, The design criteria for IP VDS. So the first one is, as I mentioned, FIPS encryption for all. All IP signals require it. Key insert this is in an effort to do the third one, the multiple independent levels of security. We want to make sure that the keys are properly distributed and change. They aren't just static keys that are used one for all. This kind of goes to the zero trust. These keys should be rotated, right? So that we make sure that, that these levels stay in their intended levels. And then there's certs based on the environments. We may need the Common Criteria Certification, for example, or we may need the Department of Defense Information Networks APL certifications. It depends on the environment and the requirements for the ATO, the authority to operate. Now, at the base of this, if the challenge is to create a secure system in the manner that I have described, then we need to do that at the beginning. Here's a curious story for you. I had my lead developer work for Apple a long time ago, and they were creating an application for a certain Department of Defense entity. And they came to them with a very interesting application. It looked like it meted all the required. They went to work and got the whole application done, and boy, they were ready to get it to go. And they wanted my guy to actually say, okay, we want you to sprinkle your security dust on it, and we'll be done with it. He had to tell them they had to start all over again, because the foundation of FIPS is basically built on security bricks. And the foundation has to be put in place before you can build the application. So all of these pieces are required to meet the FIPS 140-2 grade security. Then they have to be done at the very beginning. And that means that you don't sprinkle stuff on the end of it. That's not allowed, right? What we have to do is we have to create bricks that are strong enough to meet the requirements of FIPS 140-2. And that means you start at the very beginning this way. Now, the basic concept of a system that would use VDS-IP would start with, obviously, baseband signals. But then from there on out, we want to be able to encrypt those. We want to assign a level to them. And then we want to traverse them across the network. So each flow coming out of any of these endpoints are encrypted and then decrypted according to the class level that they're authorized for. So we'll need a control system to be able to dictate which nodes are classified, which codes are, and which users are that way. So also, if the user wants to change a source of video and audio, they have to have a secure panel. That too has to communicate back to the control system via FIPS. So the crypto is throughout. And that way we can take the signals from the left and move them to the right, much in the fashion that we did with baseband video and audio and USB. The basic concept starts with a control system. We have a sender node, and we have a receiver node, or a listener node. The control system has to have access to both, and when it does, it assigns levels to them, and it starts by traversing the signal from left to right. So the PC would emit its USB and its HDMI and audio signals to the sender. The sender would therefore encrypt it, move it through the network, and then before the listener can listen to it, it has to be checked by the control system to make sure that the sender node is appropriate for the listener node to be able to connect to it. It's allowing connection so that the stream is now pushed into the switch. The switch then is connected by the control system, and the listener node is now lit up and decrypting the proper information for the officer or the agent that's displaying that information in his or her work area. To bring this to light a little better so you can see perhaps an idea of how this might be accomplished, we would have a control system, for example, and it's talking to the switch network. By the way, that control system has to talk to the switch, and we'd need some level of FIPS, so we're going to assume that. If we take our secure rack room and we put all the assets in there and we put our sender nodes inside there, the first thing that we'd do is identify we have a node that's cleared or present. Once it's present, we have to know whether or not that node is running in FIPS mode. And if we see that it's running in FIPS mode, then we can do a connection. And now we can authorize and say, okay, we see who you are. And we do that through all the nodes in the secure rack room. We were verifying that each and every node is running in FIPS. The same thing would happen on the floor, or where we would connect these pieces for the senders to send to on the floor. So we might have, for example, a secure operations floor, and on the floor we might have a number of listener nodes that would run in the same fashion as the sender nodes. In other words, it would have to be able to be running in FIPS mode. Okay, check. And we want to do that to all the listener nodes and make sure that they're running in FIPS. And everything is set now. We have all the nodes that we want to talk to. We have them all running in FIPS mode, and now it's time to designate which senders are classified, unclassified, and secret. And the same thing is true for the users using the nodes on the far end. We would designate the nodes on the secure floor as those three classifications as well. So the first one might be, for example, a C for classified, and maybe a black U for unclassified, and then we would maybe use a yellow S for secret, and we would do that throughout the facility, and we would have a number of senders and number of listeners with each designated nodes. Now we would bring in the users and make sure that they're cleared, and they would register as either secret, unclassified, and classified. In this example here, the person that's at this seat would be a secret officer, and he or she would be entitled to see grades below him or her, and they would be unclassified or classified and as secret. So I'm showing three classes in that seating area. The next seating area, this person here is only classified, and so he's only entitled to see class and unclass. With a touch panel, he can maybe change his two nodes and connect to nodes in the secure rack room that he's been cleared to connect to, and they might be changed. So he would take his touch panel and he would call for two classified sources, for example, to change from unclassified to classified. So those are authorized and changed. So he's now seeing video and audio that he's authorized to see in that class. Now, there are two kind of classifications. This goes true with any kind of orchestration you're going to do with IP, whether it be data, sensitive data, or whether it be audio and video. In this case, essence signals that we're concerned with. In a VDS, obviously, we would have video and audio, but these would be considered essence signals. So USB, audio, video would all be encrypted and moved from east to west. We would consider this the data plane, right? The control system, on the other hand, would have to have access to all those nodes, but it would also have to be able to traverse itself separately. So in other words, these audio and video signals are staying within the context of the SCIF, and the control system might be external to this so that it can control. This allows more redundancy for the control system and a better, more flexible way to do this, and definitely more secure. So we've divided this really kind of into two parts here. We have a data plane that addresses the actual video and audio flows, and then we have a control piece. Now, if the design were such that the control plane were made of Kubernetes Docker containers, which these are already underway in many of the DoD initiatives, but it would also have the ability to create these authorization levels so that we can check off which nodes will be connected to which users and so forth, in the slide that I showed you earlier. On the data plane, these are all the nodes that would be connected, and the nodes would include the nodes that we talked about in that one slide where we have an audio video, for example, a touch panel for another, and also the switch. So the idea here is that you have the data plane moving signals from east to west, and then you have control planes. And in this case, you could be connected to a secure cloud, a military cloud, right? Or it could be on premises. There's a lot of flexibility because we built it in, or it could be built with Kubernetes, right? So the control plane could look like this, with Kubernetes as the main kind of underlying architecture with containers in that Kubernetes pods. Then the deployment or the software could be deployed on premises, or it could be deployed in secure clouds. On the other hand, the nodes are akin to, say, Connect blocks, but each of these blocks is FIPS blocks, right? So they're secured. It's very important that the security of these blocks be able to be connected just as if they weren't. So we would have endpoints that would have audio, video, USB as transmitters or senders, and receivers like listeners. We could even have a combo, a unit, for example, that might have both. Touch panels that allow users to change videos and audios as they do now. Specialty nodes for CAC readers and token readers, and perhaps USB microphones or cameras. These are all nodes that could be connected, provided they're all secure. These pieces of data that move from east to west are dictated and connected, not willy-nilly or at the request of the user, rather by the authority level dictated by the controller. So we have two distinct planes. The idea behind the node is really interesting. This is where IP really shows its strength. A separate USB signal has a typical rectangle little plug, or it's the USB-C variety, which is a little smaller. But the idea here is it's still a baseband signal. HDMI, the same way. This was shown earlier. And then audio could be a twisted pair, could be a number of things. This is encapsulated and then encoded and then encrypted. And now each of these signals are broken up into separate IP or multicast addresses so that each of them can be manipulated separately. We might have, for example, the need to connect USB to a different device without affecting video and audio. This would be important if we wanted the flexibility to change the video but not the audio and the USB. So all of those signals fit into one Ethernet connection. Now that greatly reduces wiring, but we can also do the same thing on the receive end. The USB would be taken, maybe apart from the video, maybe apart from the audio, and maybe we need all three. The versatility of it would be the same. We would take those flows individually, decrypt them individually, decode them, and then de-encapsulate them and present them back out to the eventual device they need to be read at. Now, the IP matrix. In our old example where we had a square box, we were dictated to have so many inputs and so many outputs. In an Ethernet matrix, we don't have that concern. We can simply build it as we go forward. We can start small and build quite large. Tens of thousands of nodes could be connected in these kinds of architectures. However, the underlying architecture that's required for video, especially video, is a non-blocking architecture. Now, let me kind of explain what that means. If you send a print queue to a printer, you may get a little bit of a delay before you actually get your printed page. It's no concern. It's going to take some time to print it anyway, so it's kind of an inherent kind of a lived-with thing, and it's not that insensitive that it has to. If I do that with video, it's not quite the same way because the video will be interrupted. That's not acceptable. We have to have the video running, especially live video. We have to have that video running at all times. So the idea of an IP network matrix is leveraged off a leaf and spine. So the challenge here is to make sure that each of the leafs that are connected to the spines, could be several, could be one or two, but we'd want to know where the node from switch 1 goes to the node that's on the other switch. And something has to manage that network. We call that a software-defined network. But in that sense, the control plane is a part of the switch fabric. In other words, the switch fabric has to be aware of what connections you're trying to make, and it communicates back to the Kubernetes plane in a manner that's suitable. And what's the answer? It's FIPS. So we have to have FIPS to control the Ethernet fabric so that we can properly make sure that no intruders come into any of these ports, and we have to be alerted if somebody does. Or we have to make sure that somebody's not trying to connect a port to another one. Again, these are all encrypted from the very beginning, and these keys are changing and moving, and those are the kinds of security pieces that are prevalent in today's new architectures. A traditional SCIF features an isolation area where everything's kind of cordoned off from the world, and then it's isolated, but it has very physical boundaries. Traditionally, the assets are placed on the floor so that a seat is dictated by the authority level. For example, we might have a number of officers on the floor that are dictated as classified. They physically sit in those seats as classified. If we want to move those around, or if we have a mission that requires all secret, we have no other means other than to have those dedicated seats be limited to just the seats that we have in this floor. So, for example, the 3 last ones might be top secret. If we wanted to clear everybody out, that's the only seats that are available. So what we're seeing is the idea that moving the assets back to secure locations is a pretty good idea. That way we can change at the speed of the mission. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that our secure room is in fact secure, and that we've taken all the assets that were on the floor into the secure room. In this fashion, the signals that are generated by these secure devices can be doled out to the listeners on the floor in any fashion or flavor that the mission demands. This might be a room for all classified, so we'd need every seat available for classified. On the other hand, we might change the mission to all secret. And so all the offices are removed, all the secret personnel are moved in, and all the assets of secret can be now moved to the floor. This is the advantage of doing this kinds of architecture. This isn't a topic that I'm bringing up. This is a topic that's coming up time and again. There's a DevSecOps initiative. There's a whole bunch of other initiatives, and everybody's talking about being able to securely share information across a wide area network. And this involves audio and video. But because audio and video is baseband, this is extremely challenging. So this is a conversation we're involved in as a group, as a company, PESA. The virtual SCIF is something that is secure. And the idea of being able to move classified information across military confines is coming up. Certainly the COVID battle with the key personnel being at home. There's also the challenges of having specialty information officers that are not in SCIF. That might be. There might be even the idea that we need a particular person not come to the SCIF, but actually see a part of the SCIF that's being allowed. So we need an architecture that could allow parts of the SCIF to be distributed in a secure fashion. Now this obviously dictates that all of these signals be using encrypted communications back to it, but it does allow the use of these audio, video, and USB signals to be presented to generals and commanders that need to know the instant something in the mission is critical. They might be in the SCIF, that's true, but they may not be. And that's where the discussions around the idea of a distributed C2 environment is coming up. So all of the parameters that we've just discussed are front and center. So the power is in the cloud, right? This is the architectures of new ones. That doesn't mean that necessarily our east-west, our data flows, are in the cloud, but it does mean that the control could be in the cloud. I say could be because in certain areas we would demand that we would have on-premises cloud containers. The idea, though, is the container can be placed in any cloud structure. It could be a private cloud, it could be a public cloud, it could be a secure cloud, it could be an on-prem cloud. Obviously, for security reasons, for the Department of Defense, for example, these would be secure military enclaves. So it does open up a whole chunk of possibilities and being able to secure signals when they need to be secured. And we gain the advantage of being able to traverse IP, video, audio, and USB across these enclaves. So to summarize, the security behind baseband doesn't exist. Neither does most IP. So we would have to have the requirement of securing these signals. Audio, video, and USB needs separation. We need to be able to separate them out according to authority level, like classified, unclassified. This maintains security. IP needs to be FIPS encrypted. This is a requirement for all DoD. So this is a secure method. MILs for unclass, class, secret, and others needs to be carefully thought out and policies generated for their use inside or as it traverses outside a SCIF. This is, again, another security requirement. The understanding of secured targets are important to look at closely by those trying to validate the use of an audio, video, and USB target. The certs may be one piece, but it doesn't answer it until you go through what those certs say. That's why it's important to read the security targets. The virtual SCIF is something that needs to be carefully architected. It's not just willy-nilly, well, we encrypted it, well, it has a class. No, there's more to it than what I've presented, but it's the general idea that it could be moved out. I thank you all for the opportunity to speak before you, and George, I'll give it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott, so much. As we mentioned before, we will discuss the results of the poll questions before we move into Q&A. So the first poll, the number one answer was external cyber attack at 41.2%. The next most popular answer was human error at 26.3%. And then the insider threat at 24.9%. Illness compromising C2 at 5.3%. And then natural disaster, lack of a backup plan, and none all got 0%. So any surprises there, Scott?
None whatsoever. No, that completely validates my thinking as well.
Yeah, okay. And then on our second poll, the FIPS received 28.2%, the JITIC 20.5%, the DODN and NIAP tied at 17.9% exactly, and CSFC Commercial Solutions for Classified Systems came in at 15.4%. Are those results expected as well, or?
Absolutely, no. That's right on. And it's funny that DODN and JITIC there receive such high allowances, but at the root of it, you have to have the FIPS first, so it's good.
Okay, so you would say that the audience got it right.
I absolutely do.
Okay, excellent. We do have time for a few questions, and plenty of questions in. So our first question is, what is the difference between a fixed key and dynamic keys, and is this important?
It's extremely important. So in a fixed key environment, it's really not considered secure. In fact, it would be hard to get through any of the certification that George just spoke to in a fixed key arrangement. And the reason why is because the key is exposed. To place the key in a fixed arrangement means that once it's known, and then the cat's out of the bag, it can be compromised. In dynamic keys, those keys change fluidly as the mission proceeds, during the mission, and apart from the mission. So no one key could be copied and used again. So it's usually forbidden to use a fixed key arrangement in any of these scenarios I pointed out in the slide deck here.
Okay, very good. The next question, does having security implemented impact latency? And if so, can you estimate by how much?
Yes. So it would be important to choose a codec, a compression codec that has very little latency. The ones that have the highest latency are the motion codecs. These would be the H.264s or MPEG-2, MPEG-4. The new one is HEVC. It's still very latent. We're talking about a quarter of a second to half a second. Those are very critical times. In the mezzanine types, which are using wavelet compression, the latency is almost non-existent. These would be the J2Ks, the JPEG 2000 variants, VC2, a number of other codecs that favor latency over payload. So they tend to be a little higher in payload in terms of their actual ability to compress the signal, but the latency is extremely low. In the C2 environments, it would probably be a mezzanine codec that would be preferred because they offer no latency.
Okay, great. We have a very smart audience. They're asking great questions. How is multi-class secured in baseband versus IP?
Yeah, so we know of very little ways to do the baseband. There's no real way to assure that The baseband can be encrypted or secured or even put through multiple levels. It's a curious arrangement. PESA as a company looked at it years and years ago, and we even rethought it again. It would be lovely if we could find a secure method to secure baseband, but so far there's really no practical method to do that with the signal proper. In IP, obviously, there's been encryption around for a long, long time, so this is an established standard, and that's why there's the likes of NIST that's dictating what kind of crypto you can use with IP. So, baseband signals, not so much. I don't really subscribe to it because a baseband signal at the end of the day can be picked up and decoded without any effort. And in IP, it's a much stronger, harder case to make.
Okay, super. How does all the bespoken relate to SATCOM or wireless communication?
Wireless falls underneath FIPS requirements, and I believe they're under FIPS 800, but they are allowed in certain SCIFs, and others they're not. They're forbidden. Wireless could be used if it's secured. Again, this would involve the RF transmission as well as the IP transmission, and there are standards around that. They would be FIPS standards. So, they could be used, but it's also at the or the permission of the intended environment that they would be allowed or disallowed. It's entirely possible to do that because that's being done now, and they are secured in my estimation.
Okay, great. We have a multi-part question. Someone in the audience says that they've seen a lot of products with CC and EALS. What is EAL 2, 3, 4, etc.? Does that equate to security? Is that the same level of protection as FIPS?
No, they're very two different distinct pieces, right? So the EAL falls under common criteria. It's addressing more of the system, so it depends on what's been defined in that EAL. You won't know whether 2 has been used correctly or 4 has been used correctly or 5 has been used correctly until you identify what the certification states. So it's important to go through a section that would identify the security target. They are all required in EAL, and you have to look at the security target and see if it's addressing the environment that you want to place it into. So if a particular vendor has an EAL4, for example, you have to look at the security target and see that the threats that you're considering or that you're most sensitive to have been addressed. In other words, is it addressing denial attacks? Is it addressing open ports? These are all should be listed in the STIGs, for example, for Doden, or the security pieces that in parts that would revolve around the environment that you're wanting this piece to operate in. The point is, not many people are looking inside the EAL. They just look at the EAL4, figure, okay, check, it's good enough. Well, what we're finding is there is a lot of slop there, and a lot of vendors have gotten away with a lot there. And I think it's very important, not only as a vendor community, but as a buyer community, and look at those certs very carefully to see that they meet the requirements of a particular facility.
Okay, excellent. I think since we did get started late, maybe we have time for one or two more. How are devices authorized in IP and in SDI?
So in SDI, they're not authorized. That's very difficult to do. They have to be done at the control level. So you could say that only these people will have control panels that can access, signals number 1, 5, 7, 23, and these have all been deemed to be classified, for example. This is how they were done in the past. They might even have a separate router in SDI that would be just classified or just secret, what have you. That would be a traditional air gap. That's how SDI was addressed. But in the IP domain, we could actually mix them in separate networks, or we could air gap them, depending on the requirements of the facility. It's extremely difficult to keep the signals apart from another once they arrive inside the matrix. That goes true of IP as well. But in IP, each signal is scrambled, so to speak. In this case, it's encrypted, heavily encrypted, because it has to use FIPS, right? But in STI, there is no such requirement. So technically speaking, anything that goes into a matrix box is available to any destination. I can't be convinced that anything could not traverse out of that box otherwise, because they're baseband signals. They were never intended to be protected or scrambled or encrypted. They were meant to be open.
Okay, and last one. If someone disconnects an endpoint and plugs it into a non-secure device, either because they actually have bad intentions or they're just being naive, could they see anything as it applies to baseband versus IP?
Yes, that's where the one slide, if you saw the frame buffer come up, and you could see for a second, depends on the architected system, right? But if it were plugged in differently, remember in a matrix system where it's using baseband signals, anything on the floor could be plugged into anything, and it would show that level. There isn't anything obstructing it, right? Now, in the IP side of things, there's also lots of checks and balances. What's the IP address? Does the controller know that it's been moved to a different port? So the system has to be comprehensive. It has to address not only the endpoints and the classifications that they've been set for, but do they match up against the ports that you've set also? So if the user decides to set up a certain an area where a classified personnel might be sitting, and he has deemed that all the boxes on his are classified for one mission, for example, we want to make sure that if the IP is moved, as was described here in this question, that the boxes are rechecked. So the controller has to be aware, oh, they moved the cable. That's not good. We have to alert somebody. So the crypto officer or the officer in charge of the facility would say, oh, there's been a mistake. And so the ability to display anything has been forbidden because they haven't even been connected. We just know that, or there has to be a method to describe or be able to alert that nothing is going to be connected until it's going back to the original way that it was intended to be connected. That's a loaded question. lots of scenarios.
All right. Well, we appreciate the answers and the entire presentation. That was jam-packed with useful information. So thank you for that, Scott. And thank you to our viewers for submitting questions. If you submitted a question that did not get answered, someone from PESA will try to follow up with you directly offline. Please note that there are some resources available to you under the Resources tab. And I'd like to point out that you can continue to link to the archived version of this webinar and see previous Signal webinars on AFCEA's Signal Magazine website. That concludes our Signal Media webinar for today. Again, we thank all of you for being with us. Have a great day, everybody.